Welcome everyone to Digital Earth Oceans. We're so excited to have you here. During the program, if you have any questions or comments, please put those in the chat. You won't see each other's chats, but I will be keeping an eye on them. And at the end, we'll have some time for our presenters to answer those questions. We will go for about an hour. And then if you need to leave, absolutely go to bed, it's school night. But if you can stick around, we'll have a little extra time for Bob and Ka Chun to answer some questions. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to our curator of space sciences, Dr. Ka Chun Yu.
All right, thank you very much, Mitch. And before I begin, I just like to acknowledge that we in Denver at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science on the lands today that were the traditional homes of the Cheyenne and the Arapaho, who were the original stewards of this land. And we also acknowledge other indigenous tribes and nations that make Colorado home. So welcome again to Digital Earth. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, along with those of you who are long-time viewers of Digital Earth. For those of you who haven't been to one of our programs before, let me just explain the brief philosophy behind it. What we do is we try to present our planet Earth as seen from space. And so we use data sets and images taken from spacecraft in orbit around our planet. And normally we do this in the planetarium, but for now we will continue doing online programming beamed out to your homes. We will be using data from both NASA as well as NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And so we'll be looking at data sets as well as visualizations from both of those federal agencies. The software that we'll be primarily flying around in is called OpenSpace, and it's a NASA-funded project. And we also have an online survey, which Mitch will post at the very end of the program. And Mitch, you might even want to post that at the beginning too, but we'll try and make sure to post it at the end. And because this project is funded by NASA, we do want to find out from you, our guests, to see how we are doing and how we can improve on our programs in the future. So definitely fill that out after the end of our show. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Bob Raynolds, who is a research associate at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science and a geologist who will begin our presentation. Bob, take it away.
Well, thank you very much, Ka Chun, and welcome everybody to Digital Earth. And this is a program that we typically run about every other month. And we often do it in the planetarium at the museum, but here we're using Zoom technology, and it's a wonderful opportunity for us to share the visualizations that we have in the planetarium well beyond the footprint of the Denver Museum. But it's a great joy for the museum to put this material together. And thank you to Ka Chun for flying, and thank you to Mitch for organizing and other people who are behind the scenes making this work. And this evening's presentation is it's a presentation on oceans, the world's oceans, and I'm a geologist, and Ka Chun is an astronomer. So you're going to be receiving information about oceans from a geologist and an astronomer, and I think we'll try to make it an interesting foray. The program is going to be divided into basically three parts. The first part is going to be the physical oceanography, looking at where the oceans are and sort of what their shape and size and character is. And then there'll be a section on the biology of the oceans, what the creatures live in the oceans. And then we're going to look into the future of the ocean. So those are the three parts. And we're going to run about an hour long. And we'll have what we call a slow close. So at about 8 o'clock, if anybody needs to duck out, that's perfectly fine, of course. But we'll have some questions and answers that might go till about 5 or 8 minutes after 8 o'clock. So that's our plan for the evening. And grab yourselves a beverage and join the show. So Ka Chun is illustrating the overview of one of the facets of the Earth. The Earth is known as the water planet, and over 70% of the Earth's surface is covered in water. And many of you, of course, will notice there's a little island chain right in the middle of this view. We were talking about it with students the other day, and they said, well, it looks like a giant blueberry. and the blueberry has Hawaii in it, the Hawaiian island chain. And the Pacific Ocean is the largest of all the oceans, and it's a magnificent, vast expanse. And if you see it from space, you can see why we often think of the Earth as being the blue planet or the water planet. We're going to switch to one of our data displays, of which we're going to have a variety to show you over the course of the evening. And this is to illustrate the topography, or the bathymetry, more properly spoken. You can see the island chain of Hawaii, the Emperor Seamounts trailing behind the main island. As we're crossing around to the east, we'll see there's a deep sea trench down there in Central America, and that's where the ocean is subducting underneath the North American plate. And we're going to be crossing the Caribbean and looking at the North Atlantic. And you'll appreciate as we look at the North Atlantic that there's a ridge running down the middle of the North Atlantic, which is called the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. And that's going to be a very important part of our story as we launch into the genesis of the ocean basins. And we're going to do that by illustrating a database that shows the color-coded age of the sea floors. So as we work our way around, we're going to transition to a data set that comes from Science on a Sphere. And the color code here represents the age of the ocean floor, with the red color being the young and the yellow and green and ultimately purple being the older. And you'll recognize at once that there's a red stripe that follows the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. It comes across into the Indian Ocean, which we're seeing now. There's an Indian Ocean ridge. It passes south of the island or continent of Australia. And you can see the red zone south of Australia. And then ultimately, as we work our way around to the east, we'll be coming back into the Pacific Ocean. Some of the oldest ocean crust is in the Pacific Ocean, and you'll see some purples and almost brownish colors. There's some of the very old oceanic crust on the western side of the Pacific. But as we circle around to the East Pacific, you'll see what we call the East Pacific Rise. And you'll appreciate that there's a lot more red here than you saw in the North Atlantic, if you remember the scale. And we might noodle over towards the North Atlantic. And the reason is because the East Pacific Rise is spreading faster at a higher rate, actually about 10 times faster than the North Atlantic. So there's more very young oceanic crust in the Pacific than there is in the Atlantic because of the rate of seafloor spreading. So these data sets were derived by studying the age of the seafloor using magnetic anomalies. And the Earth's magnetic field alternates between north and south. And that polar transition of the Earth's magnetic field is recorded in the lava rocks on the floor of the oceans. And it creates something called seafloor stripes that some of you might have heard about. And we've used those seafloor stripes and our understanding of the age of the seafloor to reconstruct the ancient history of the oceans. And a fellow named Chris Scotese has made quite a career of this, and he's a wonderful geologist, and he's put together a series of models that have been animated. And here you're seeing from approximately 200 million years ago, the model will run forward up to about 0. We're looking at the Appalachian Mountains. We've got the African landmass and South American landmass on the right, the North American landmass on the left. And here actually the North Atlantic Ocean is opening up. It's about Triassic time, 200 million years ago. And you'll see the Gulf of Mexico forming there on the left. And then the South Atlantic is just starting to open there. You'll start to see the shape of Africa and the shape of South America being defined as the South Atlantic Ocean opens up. And this data and these reconstructions come from our understanding of the age of the seafloor. And we're very confident with the patterns in the last few 100 million years. As we go back in time, it gets a little bit more obscure. But here you're looking at the evolution of the North and South Atlantic Oceans as the continents of Africa moved away from the continent of South America. You'll see a few interior seaways as sea levels go up and down. There's been times when sea has flooded the land. And we're going to swing around. We're going to leave the North Atlantic, and we just want to recreate this vision over on the Indian Ocean side. So you can see the effects of India as it moves to the north across the what was the Indian Ocean, or actually the Tethys Ocean. So the model will go forward. It'll be a little bit difficult to see where we are, but basically Gondwana is to the south, and the big Tethys Ocean is there on the north, on the central part of the screen. And in just a moment, you're going to see India detach itself from Australia and southern Africa. And there you've got India and Madagascar, and India is starting to move towards the north, and it moved across the Tethys Sea, and it is going to collide with the rocks of Asia. And of course, it's not moving through the rocks. The whole plate is moving, including oceanic crust. And here you can see the collision that defines eventually the Himalaya Mountains. You can see the Himalaya Mountains forming there on the north of the Indian subcontinent. India is still moving on the order of 4 to 5 centimeters a year to the north. So this tectonic activity is still happening. And there are still earthquakes, of course, in Pakistan and Afghanistan, Nepal, India, and spreading off into Southeast Asia and China. So that activity is continuing to move today. And we have studied the mid-ocean ridges in great detail. And I had a chance to work on some of them when I was a graduate student. And we studied the topography of the seafloor, and we identified little volcanoes on the seafloor. And then since then, we've sent cameras down to the mid-ocean ridges, and we're going to show you, here's the mid-Atlantic ridge. We're going to show you some videos of what goes on when you get down to the mid-ocean ridges. And here's the first one. And this is an active volcano on the floor of the ocean. And you can see it's creating explosions. There's material breaking up and falling down. You can see hot magma coming out. And there isn't really steam because the pressures are so great at this level. So the bubbles don't form, but you've got all kinds of chaos going on down there on the floor of the oceans. And in fact, we believe that the majority of the Earth's volcanoes are actually hiding on the sea floor. So we know of many volcanoes on the Earth's surface, but once we appreciated that the mid-ocean ridges are made up of volcanoes, there's thousands and thousands of kilometers of volcanic ridges buried beneath the sea. And you can see it gets pretty dramatic down there. And not only do we have volcanoes, we've also got hot springs. And this is something that was discovered quite a few years ago. And the water, we're going to get in there and we're going to see the water coming out. And the water is carrying all kinds of interesting minerals, including iron and manganese. And the water is a dark color. And I think, Ka Chun, it might be frozen a little bit. So we'll try to get this video to move. There you go. And you'll see that up at the top of the screen, the dark material, there it is, the dark stuff coming out. It's mineral laden water, and it's super hot. And the first guys that explored these things were down in submersibles, and they had plastic hands and plastic baskets and things. And the water is super hot. And they realized that they risked melting their plastic. There's also all kinds of life down there. You'll see the little crabs and crayfish-like kind of critters that are living down there. There's an astonishing amount of biodiversity down on the sea floors. There's a clam, things that we never would have expected before we understood the nature of these environments. Now, the other way that we study the mid-ocean ridge is it's beneath the ocean, of course, for the most part, but the mid-Atlantic ridge comes up to the air in Iceland. And many of you will have been to Iceland. Iceland, of course, is a fabulous place to visit, and there are nonstop flights there from Denver. I think they've started up again. And you can go to Iceland, and the northern part of the mid-Atlantic ridge comes out on the Reykjanes Peninsula on the southern end of Iceland, very near the airport. When you land in Keflavik, which is the airport in Iceland, you're on the Reykjanes Peninsula, which is that little peninsula sticking out on the lower left-hand side of Iceland. And that is the actual mid-Atlantic ridge that comes up above the water in Iceland. And you can visit it, and it's a fantastic place to go. There's all kinds of things to see in Iceland, including, of course, the beautiful geology and the active volcanoes. So Iceland today has an active volcano on the Reykjanes Peninsula. And this is a video that was taken by the Icelandic public television system. And you can see the little cinder cones and the scoria coming out, and then actually basaltic lava flowing. It's coming out. It flows relatively easily, and it can flow long distances. And the Icelandic people, of course, got all excited when this volcano started erupting, which was about, I'd say, 2 months ago. And the people from Reykjavik came out and they had to walk across a little bit of the countryside to get there. And they carried their sticks and their hot dogs. And they got to this erupting volcano and they roasted their hot dogs over the incandescent rock. It evidently works very well for that purpose. But you've got to bring your own stick because in Iceland, there's not a lot of trees around. So this is an example of what's going on the floor of the oceans, but here we can see it because it's actually above sea level in Iceland. And we're going to continue our story about the genesis of the oceans. And I'm just going to give you a little vignette over by the Red Sea, just to show you another place that I've worked on when I was a student. And the Red Sea is quite symmetrical. And you can appreciate that the sides of the Red Sea could be matched together. And when we were students, we actually took paper. We had maps, big maps of the Red Sea, and we cut the paper out to try to reconstruct the Red Sea before it had spread open. And we had some trouble here on the lower right-hand side because there's some complexity as you get into the Afar Triangle of Ethiopia and Eritrea. And that turns out to be a little sliver of continental crust that broke off there called the Danakil Alps. But the Red Sea, relatively symmetrical, illustrating pretty clearly the fact that the thing, it was once one unit, it spread apart. You can see a mid-ocean ridge running down the axis of the Red Sea. And then just to keep the mass balance, if we back up a teeny bit, Ka Chun will see the Arabian Peninsula, which is moving away from Africa, is actually colliding with the mountains in Iran. And those are called the Zagros Mountains. And as you come up from Iraq and into Iran, there's a whole series of compressional folds that are formed because of the collision of the Arabian Peninsula with this part of Asia. And as you work your way down towards the Makran coast of Pakistan, just across from the Straits of Hormuz there's a subduction zone and there's some volcanoes that are erupting in that area intermittently. So we believe that the surface of the Earth is not expanding. And as you generate seafloor crust at the mid-ocean ridges, you're destroying it in these subduction zones and in these collision belts. So there's a mass balance there where the amount that is generated is compensated by the amount that is lost, and the surface of the Earth maintains a uniform surface area. So we've introduced here sort of the genesis of the oceans. They're formed by continental drift. As far as we understand it, our data are good back at least hundreds of millions of years. Then we lose seafloor crust because of this process of subduction. But we've used geological clues to push plate tectonics and continental drift certainly back 1 billion years. And we believe that this pattern of ocean formation and change through time has gone on for at least 1 billion years. So the character of the oceans in terms of their general configuration, their shape and size and depth is well understood and well mapped, of course, and is known through time. Now, the oceans are, of course, full of water, and the water does not sit still. So we've got some wonderful data sets to visualize how the water is moving. And this is a color-coded, computerized rendition of how the surface currents are moving on the surface of the oceans. And here we're looking at the Pacific Ocean, and you're seeing the equatorial flow. This will vary according to the season and according to the tempo of the El Nino process. But these are the currents that are moving across the Pacific, which are responsible for the El Nino La Nina phenomenon. And as you come across into the Caribbean, you'll see the brighter colors, which represent the warmer currents. And you'll recognize the swirls coming up through the Caribbean, defining eventually the Gulf Stream. And you can see the Gulf Stream there flowing up along through the straits between Cuba and Florida, and then between Florida and the Bahamas. And that water is moving on the order of 5 to 6 miles per hour, which is quite significant. And it starts out about 75 degrees Fahrenheit down in Florida. It gradually cools off as it moves to the northeast, but it's responsible for warming the area of England, the British Isles, and the Scandinavian portion of northwestern Europe. So that warm water goes all the way across the oceans and warms northern Europe. And it's a phenomenon that was observed by Benjamin Franklin. And Benjamin Franklin, as you might know, was a diplomat, and he had important business in Paris, which involved a lot of liaisons. And I don't need to go into the details of Benjamin Franklin's diplomacy, but he was always in a hurry to get from the United States to Paris because he had various appointments. And he learned, actually by talking to the mariners, he learned that if you stayed in the warm water, you got to France faster. And then when you wanted to come back to the United States from Europe, you had to stay in cooler water. And there was quite a time back in Benjamin Franklin's time when they were learning about the surface distribution of sea currents. And of course, in those days, there were sailing ships, and it was very frustrating if you're trying to sail and the wind was blowing at 5 or 6 miles an hour, but if the current was going in the wrong direction, 5 or 6 miles an hour, you wouldn't go very far. So it was a substantial innovation for the people to map these currents. And the Gulf Stream could be mapped by simply measuring the temperature of the water. You wanted to be in warm water if you're heading for Europe, and you want to be in cold water if you're heading for North America. Now, this again is the surface currents, and they're complicated as indicated by these gyres, but they generally tend to flow in patterns that are very well understood. And of course, the currents are in 3 dimensions. And so the map that we're showing now illustrates what's called the thermo-haline distribution of currents. And thermo-haline is fancy for temperature and salt. And basically it deals with the temperature of the water and the saltiness of the water. And the warmer the water is, it'll have a tendency to be light and buoyant. The colder it is, it'll tend to sink. And then the saltier it is, it'll tend to sink because it's dense. And there's a worldwide system of currents that are moving the water in a relatively complicated fashion because you've got to see it in 3 dimensions. The whitest stuff is relatively high or near the surface. The greener stuff or bluer stuff is down low. And so there's this constant movement of currents around the entire world ocean, which is actually one giant body of water if you think about it from the standpoint of the moving water. And on the average of over about 1,000 years, the waters in the oceans are mixed and circulated. So the process of moving from up to the north, the waters then get cold and they sink down and they slide down into the South Atlantic and they circulate around and back. And that takes about 1,000 years. So there's quite a long period there in terms of these ocean currents. And, you know, we've mapped the currents by having ships wandering around on the surface of the ocean for hundreds of years. And so our knowledge of the currents is fairly good. But in terms of better understanding the character of the oceans, we've switched to a system of floats or buoys. And there's a system called the Argo buoy system, which Ka Chun is showing you right now. And this represents a series of buoys that are floating in the Pacific Ocean in this case, but they're a worldwide grid. And there's over 3,700 of these buoys, and they're autonomous floating laboratories. And each one of them, they're about the size of a fire hydrant with a little bit of an extension on it. And they are tossed over into the ocean, and they are programmed to submerge down into the ocean body. And they go down sometimes as much as 2,000 meters or more. And they take measurements, and then they float back up to the surface, and they send the measurements up via satellite, and then they repeat the process. So back when I was an undergraduate student studying oceanography, we had ship tracks and various records from people that have been sailing ships. But today we've got this wonderful grid of measurements coming. There's huge data sets, and you can see it's worldwide. So we've got a much better understanding today of ocean patterns than we did just 20 or 30 or 40 years ago. And this program, of course, has been very successful. It's ongoing. And you can see the north-south stripes, the purple ones. There's a set out there in the Pacific, right around the equator. And those are designed to keep an eye on the El Nino process, because the El Nino, La Nina is a process of ocean circulation that's sort of sloshing back and forth. The warm water sloshes back and forth on a big scale in the Pacific Ocean. And it used to be we had only relatively dim knowledge about that, but now we've got tremendous data. and we can see exactly how those currents are behaving through time. This is called the Argo buoy system, and it is sending data up to the Json satellite. So the Json satellite is used to look at the Argo buoys, and that's a reference to the mythological Jason and the Argonauts. You might remember, I think the Argonauts were Jason's crew, and they were in the ship called the Argo, if I remember correctly. Now we're going to take this information. So we've given you the shape and size of the oceans, their general dimensions, and now we're going to look and see who's there. You know, what's in the oceans in terms of life. And this is another data set that comes from the Science on a Sphere and put together by NOAA and by NASA. And this is a data set that shows the actual response of photosynthesis, both on land and in the water. So it's a combination of satellite imagery data, and you're looking at the onshore photosynthesis, and it's the response of chlorophyll, as you can see in the little caption down there, with the brighter colors being more and the darker colors, the blues, being less. And the thing that you'll appreciate immediately, of course, is that there's life throughout the oceans. Even in the middle parts of the big oceans like the Pacific, there are phytoplankton that have chlorophyll in them, and you can see their signature from space. So that the oceans are essentially breathing. We're seeing an annual cycle. There's a carbon dioxide graph there, and this tendency for there to be sort of a pulse represents the annual cycle of biology on the surface of the earth, not only on the land, but also in the waters. And of course, from the standpoint of bioproductivity, the occurrence of these phytoplankton and algae that are photosynthesizing, they're forming one of the principal elements of the food chain. And so when you look at data like this, you're able to get a somewhat of a handle on marine bioproductivity, or the amount of vegetation and plant life and eventually animal life that lives in the seas. And you'll see that there's lots of patterns of near coastal flourishings. We've got the Amazon Delta just going out of view. You'll see bioproductivity along the coast of West Africa, which was in the picture that Mitch showed. Mitch had the picture of the northwestern Africa behind him. And offshore Africa, there's upwelling of nutrient-rich waters, and there's a tremendous amount of bioproductivity in that area. And of course, where you get the small phytoplankton and the rich biology, you then get creatures that feed on them. And so it is not too much of a surprise if we look at the fish species richness. We're going to switch to a data set that's going to show us the richness of fish species. And here, the yellow colors represent the biological hotspots, if you will, where there's high diversity of fish. And this isn't necessarily the density of fish, this is the number of different species of fish. But you'll appreciate that the shallow waters of the South China Sea, the area north of Australia, between Australia and New Guinea, and then the islands of the Southwest Pacific, which would be the reefs of the Southwest Pacific, are areas of intense biological activity and a considerable number of different species of fish. And the same pattern will hold as we cross the ocean. You see the island chain of Hawaii and the Emperor Sea Mountains just going out of view. And then the coastal waters of the Americas and the Caribbean off the Yucatan, and then on the coast of South America, and the rich biodiversity associated with these nearshore environments. And it's a fantastic tool to see this. And you can see again, here's the West African case we were talking about before, where we knew that there was a lot of bioproductivity from the photosynthesis maps we saw previously. And then you'll see the high diversity of marine life with those yellow colors, really following the continental margins pretty closely. And of course, this is something that's very important from the point of view of fisheries, and the fish species richness is something that is closely tracked by fishing community. And there's been tremendous technological advances in fishing. We've got Somalia right here. We might just mention here the waters off of Somalia are relatively rich in biodiversity, and the people from Somalia would fish in those coastal waters. And then the international fishing fleets would come in, and they'd recognize that those yellow zones between the Horn of Africa and Socotra, for example, are rich areas for fishing. And the international fleets would come in there, and it made big competition for the coastal communities. And the people who lived in Somalia had a tremendous challenge because the droughts have been persistent over many years. The cattle had not done well, and their reliance on fishing was causing struggles. There weren't enough fish in the sea, and so the people in Somalia turned to unusual economic activities, which included piracy, as you might all remember. That took place there in the Horn of Africa, not all that long ago. It's been somewhat suppressed now, but that wasn't that long ago. And if you follow this map through, here's the Mediterranean. You can see the incredible productivity of the waters between Greece and Turkey, and then offshore Italy, the Adriatic, and then coming around off the islands of Corsica and Sardinia, and then coming over towards Spain, and then up into the areas off of France and the British Isles. So these are areas where there's known intense concentration of marine life. And there are big efforts now to figure out ways to farm fish. It's been called sea ranching. And sea ranching is an interesting phenomenon. And they've grown a wide variety of different kinds of fish in artificial environments. And we'll talk a little bit more about that coming up in a few minutes. But the oceans are also places for transportation, and a huge amount of our commercial traffic happens on the oceans. And here's a map again from Science on a Sphere, and you can see color coded the routes that are taken by commercial ships. And we're looking here at the area between South America and the Mesoamerica. So the Panama Canal would be right there in the lower central part of your screen. And you'll see that ships are coming in from all over in the Atlantic, and they go through the Panama Canal, and they tend to go north because they're heading towards Western North America and Japan. So they go right through that little Panama Canal, and then look how they spread across the Pacific Ocean. They often stop in Hawaii, and they're going across towards Japan and to China. And then if you're leaving from China and you're heading towards the Indian Ocean, you've got to go off the area just south of Singapore, south of Malaysia, and you work your way up across the northern tip of the island of Sumatra, and then drop across the southern tip of India. And then some of the ships are peeling off and going up across the Straits of Hormuz into the Persian Gulf, and others are heading into the Red Sea. And if you head into the Red Sea, you've got to go through the Bab al-Mandab Straits between Yemen and Ethiopia. But then as you come up into the Gulf of Suez, you then have to go in the Suez Canal. And we've all had the chance to watch the news in the last month. And you'll remember the tanker that became stuck in the Suez Canal I think it was stuck for about a week or 10 days. And Ka Chun has figured out exactly where it was stuck, and we're going to go find that spot. And remember, the tanker was traveling north through the Gulf of Suez, and for some reason, the wind was blowing hard on it, but for some reason, the nose hit one side, and then the tail of the tanker swung around, and it effectively blocked the entire Suez Canal. It was right here, just straight down on this. And you might have seen pictures in the newspaper of the people in the villages on the left-hand side looking at this giant tanker that was obscuring their view. And you might remember that the tanker was firmly stuck in the Suez Canal, and they were pushing on it and pulling on it and trying to dig it and dredge underneath it. And what finally got it released, if you remember, was a super high tide, and there was a full moon, and it was one of the full moons of early spring, and it was called the Moon of the Worms, because that moon comes out at the time when the earthworms are coming out in Northern Europe. So it's known as the Earthworm Moon, and that full moon was the moon that lifted the waters up 6 or 8 inches in the Gulf of Suez, the high tide, not that much, but enough to help release that giant tanker that was stuck there. And I think that tanker is still sitting up in the northern part of the Gulf of Suez, in the northern, there's a place called the Bitter Lakes. And the last news I heard, that tanker was sitting up there and they were discussing who was responsible for the repair bills and for the towing charges and things like that. So last I heard, the tanker was sitting right there in those waters that we're seeing just below us here. But you'll remember that did disrupt the global shipping patterns, and that there was a considerable amount of effort to figure out how to find alternative routes, which of course involve much extra time and extra expense to get material from Asia to Europe and vice versa. And many of the ships ended up going around the southern part of Africa, which extended their voyage considerably. You'll see that it's not a particularly common route. People do go down that way, but the preferred route is, of course, through the Gulf of Suez. Now, part of the story with our biology is that the biology, of course, shares the same waters with these ships. And so there's a tremendous amount of discussion about the impact of shipping on marine biology. And that includes animals like whales and others that are affected by these traffic zones. And as we get more and more information about the distribution of the fish and the distribution of life in the waters, we're able to try to at least regulate the way in which shipping interacts with animals. And there's been a lot of that done in coastal California to try to take care of whales, and in coastal Florida to try to take care of manatees, which are, of course, charismatic megafauna, all of them. But you can appreciate that our footprint in the waters is fairly intense, and there's lots of traffic out there, which is something that we might not know about. Now, the other thing that, of course, we need to think about with the oceans is that our footprint as a species extends into the oceans in many different ways. And we'll talk about that a little bit here as we talk about the impact of humanity on the oceans. And one of the things that's important, and many of you have heard about the fate of plastics. We've been happily producing plastics ever since that movie, what was it, The Graduate, where they recommended that people go into plastics. Well, people went into plastics in a very big way. And today, there's a huge production of plastic materials that are used in most cases only once, in some cases only once or twice. And a lot of that material ends up floating into the river systems and getting into the world's oceans. And that's an issue because the plastic material doesn't really deteriorate in the ocean waters. It will break down into smaller pieces, but these large currents form gyres here in the Indian Ocean. There's one in the Southern Atlantic, and then well known in the Pacific Ocean, which we'll see in just a moment, are these broad circulating patterns where floating material tends to get concentrated. And we've got thousands and thousands of tons of plastic floating in these ocean gyres. And that turns out to be a critically important issue because the marine biology that we've talked about, of course, eats fish and eats things they find in the oceans. And the plastic particles look a lot like fish or look a lot like something good to eat. And many seabirds, turtles, fish, and other organisms are finding these pieces of plastic to be tempting, and they're ingesting them or eating them. And in many cases, they're too big to go out the back end. And so you get a situation where birds can die because their stomachs become completely filled with plastic. And some of you might have seen images of those. And it's suggested that up to 1 million seabirds per year perish because of eating plastic in the oceans. And so that's one of the great challenges that we face as we look at the oceans. And I'll mention some potential for cleaning this up here towards the end of the talk. The other thing that's happening is sea level is rising, and many of you know that sea level is rising because of the increasing temperatures of the Earth surface. A lot of the temperature or thermal energy on the Earth's surface is going into the waters. In fact, 80 to 90% of the incoming energy is going into the warming the ocean waters. And thermal expansion is causing sea level to rise, coupled with the melting of the ice that's on land. So ice that's melting in Greenland, ice that's melting in Antarctica, ice that's melting in continental glaciers is contributing fresh water to the oceans. And then the thermal expansion is causing additional sea level rise. And the sea level is rising at about 3 millimeters per year right now. And that's very well known from this Json satellite. Interestingly, that measures the sea surface elevation, and it's been doing it for years with a series of satellites. And we've got a very good handle on that. And if I look back on my lifetime, sea level has actually risen about 6 inches in my lifetime. So global sea level has risen about 6 inches in my lifetime. And that's a significant amount of sea level rise, to the point where our coastal cities are threatened. And we're going to come down here in China and look at some of the coastal defenses. But there was recently an analysis that was in the newspapers talking about the Hurricane Sandy damage off of the east coast of the United States. And they were talking about the extent of the damage, and somewhere in excess of, I think it was $5 to $8 billion of excess damage in coastal New Jersey and those areas was due to the fact that Hurricane Sandy hit, of course, at a time when the sea level has risen in our lifetimes, and that damage was not just the hurricane, but also the effect of sea level rise. We're coming down in the vicinity of Shanghai here in China, and this is southeastern China. And Shanghai, of course, is one of the largest cities on Earth, and it's built right on the water's edge near the delta of the Yangtze River. And sea level is rising here, and the land is also tending to subside. So there's a tremendous challenge for the people living in Shanghai to deal with the fact that the sea level is rising all around them. And the Chinese people have been building protection against water for thousands of years, first for their rivers to try to prevent flooding from the rivers, and now they're building giant seawalls. And it's somewhat akin to what's been going on in the Netherlands, in the low-lying country along the North Sea, where coastal defenses have been put in for many, many years. And as we look at the coastline here, you'll recognize that there's a somewhat artificially straight features going from sort of obliquely across the screen there. And these are man-made walls that are designed to protect the low-lying farmland from the encroachment of the sea. And Ka Chun and I have wandered around using these systems like Google Earth. And you can do this at home. You could take Google Earth at home and look at some of the coastal areas around China, and you'll see all kinds of interesting construction going on. Right there's a construction site, and they're building coastal defenses to try to protect themselves from the rising sea. Now, this is a challenge for any country, and you can well imagine that the sea will be rising inexorably for the foreseeable future. And the question is going to be, how much can you keep building? Is it possible to continue to construct defenses? And you'll recognize strategies as you look at the land. There's sort of polder kind of situations. That's a word coming out of Holland, but there'll be areas that are designed to be floodable, or areas where there's no significant construction, although you can see a huge amount of agriculture in these areas, but limited amount of actual buildings or cities. And this ground is only a few meters above sea level, and we can certainly predict in the near future that there are going to be increasing challenges with keeping the water of the ocean away from the land. And there's also issues of saltwater encroachment. So the water table is impacted, and you can appreciate that there's a broad array of changes that happen as sea level is rising. Now, the other thing that's going on, again, on a global scale, is the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is soluble in seawater. And as the carbon dioxide content of the atmosphere has been increasing, the carbon going into the oceans has been increasing, and that creates an acidification phenomenon. And it's been called the, quote, the other carbon problem. And we've got a data set coming up here where we're going to look at the world's oceans, and they're going to be calibrated according to the pH, with the lighter colors being the more acidic and the darker colors being the less acidic. And we've got data sets like this that go through time, as this one is doing, is going through time. And here it starts up about 15 or 20 years ago, and it's going to go through the present and then about 20 or 30 years into the future. And if you look at the little pH graph on the lower part of the screen, you'll see the entire world's ocean is getting paler and paler as the pH climbs. And why does this matter? Or as the pH falls, and it's going to more acidic conditions. And why does this matter? Well, it matters because a huge number of the microorganisms that live in the ocean build their shells out of calcium carbonate, a mineral called aragonite, and which is like calcite. And calcite and aragonite are soluble in acidic waters. And there is a great concern that elements of the food chain, which of course start with the small microscopic life forms, are going to be impacted as the chemistry of the oceans change. So we're dealing with a situation here on a global scale. The oceans are getting warmer, the oceans are becoming more acidic, and the biological impact of these changes is relatively poorly understood. We can understand it at a laboratory scale, but as we consider, broad ocean scale ecosystem change, we have a little bit of a hard time working on figuring that out. And of course, that's an opportunity for young people to get engaged in science and marine biology in particular, to visualize what's going to be happening, and to, where practical, try to figure out ways to mitigate some of the changes that we're seeing. And there is a broad effort worldwide to try to make things better in the oceans. And there's a variety of features that are in place. And one of them is just creating ocean preserves. And it's akin to national parks or park systems. And many different coastal countries have established preserves where fishing is supposed to be limited and restricted. But the ocean always appears vast, and people gaze across the limitless sea and they imagine that there's limitless resources down there. And it's an example of the tragedy of the commons, where individuals or individual organizations will look at it and say, well, it's a vast region and I should try to find as many resources as possible for my own purposes. Well, that mentality has to gradually change, and it is changing as we're building park systems. Some of these are for recreation, some of them are simply for preservation of species, and that is a thing that's going on worldwide. And then the other thing that's happening, people are looking at, for example, the plastic pollution problem, and they're developing ideas of how to clean up the plastic. And there are organizations, there's an organization called Ocean Cleanup that has developed a system of skimming the surface of the Pacific. They've experimented in the Pacific Ocean, and they'll take a horseshoe-shaped skimming device, and it's autonomous. It floats on its own, and it's quite clever. They put these things out with their lightweight buoys to hold them up in a circular or semicircular fashion, and they've got a little sea anchor below them. And it turns out that the surface currents move more rapidly than the deeper currents, and they suspend a sea anchor down, which is like a little sail down about 500 feet below it, and it holds it because the lower currents are moving slowly. And the plastics actually come into the horseshoe-shaped collector. And again, it's an experimental system being run by Ocean Cleanup, which is run out of California, I believe. And it's an experiment to get plastic picked up from the floating surface of these gyres out in the Pacific Ocean. There's also efforts going on, for example, in California to pick up plastic along the beaches. In California, they have an ocean day once a year, and the school children from the Los Angeles area come down to the beach and they pick up plastic. And they've been doing this for many years. And the school children have a special event. They all go down onto the beach and they're given little collecting bags, and they collect plastic, and then they form themselves into diagrams like this. And there's on the order of 1,000 kids down there. This is in 2019 off of Huntington State Beach. And the kids form themselves into these shapes and patterns. And then a low-flying airplane comes over and takes their picture. And you can imagine this picture gets onto lots of refrigerators in Southern California. And those kids have picked up as much trash as they can find. The beach is clean when they're finished with it. And they've got this idea of keeping the ocean clean. It's something that they're learning since they're kids. And many countries have been putting in plastic bag bans. Some of you might have heard about Rwanda, Uganda. They're trying to do it in Kenya. And these are countries that I've worked in, and you can really see the difference when they ban plastic bags. It cleans up the landscape dramatically, because the plastic is something that sits around on the surface and is it doesn't go away. The other thing that happens is the plastic gets into the rivers, and the plastic cleanup people, the ocean cleanup people, have figured out that if they can put collectors in the 100 most plastic infested rivers around the world, they can prevent a lot of the plastic from getting into the ocean in the first place. So that's a great way that people are making a difference, and people are becoming aware of these challenges. There's also students are involved in, there's a school in New York City called the Harbor School, and we're going to find New York. We're going to leave California. We're going to go to the New York City area and look at the New York Harbor, which is one of the great harbors of the world. And you can appreciate that when Henry Hudson arrived here, he found not only this amazing harbor, but then he found this giant river that bears his name. And this was, of course, a landscape that was very lush when the first European people came here. And the Native Americans they knew how to live on this landscape, and they had developed farming techniques, and they had learned how to collect shellfish. And the first European settlers who came over learned from the Native Americans how to collect shellfish. And there was huge oyster harvesting in the early days in New York, in the New York area. And in fact, New York was called the Big Oyster before it was called the Big Apple. And I think Martin Kurlansky has written a book called The Big Oyster. And it's a fun story about the oysters in New York Harbor, which really were a source of food to the people, particularly people who were economically strapped, because the oysters were relatively easy to get a hold of, and they were relatively inexpensive in their day. But as New York got bigger and more people moved there, and the sewers discharged dirty water into the New York Harbor, the oysters were poisoned out. The water became inhospitable, and most of the oysters have died out from the New York Harbor. And we're looking down just off the south tip of Manhattan here at an island shaped a little bit like an ice cream cone. And on the north end of this island, which is called Governor's Island, is a school called the Harbor School. It's a high school. It's part of the New York City public school system. And the Harbor School has a curriculum that is tied to oceans and marine ecology and oysters. And there's a program here called the Billion Oyster Project. And the students at the school are learning how to grow oysters and how to study the water chemistry. And there's a program to recolonize the New York Harbor with oysters. And their goal is to have 1 billion oysters live in the New York Harbor. Here we're going to see the students from the school. And we've got just a little quick video clip. It'll come up, and you'll see the students are working on marine biology. They're learning how to look at, they measure the oysters. They discuss the oyster water chemistry. They also learn about the water quality and the need for clean water for the oysters. And these oysters are growing in the water. In most cases, they can't yet be eaten because they're not clean enough to eat, but they are starting to live. And these students have 30 million oysters growing around the Harbor School, and they're aiming for 1 billion. So they've still got a ways to go. But they learn all about marine biology. They learn about how to use small boats. They learn about navigation. They learn about mapping. And their whole curriculum orbits around oyster biology. And the students come across in the ferry every day from Manhattan, and they work in the school. And it's a completely wonderful place. I had a chance to visit there a couple of years ago, and I was in the ferry with the students, and I was asking them about their work on oysters, and I said, well, what's the best school in New York City? And they all said the Harbor School was the best school. So the kids have a wonderful time, and there's an exchange program going. They're trying to share their oyster biology with other schools in the New York area. So it's a wonderful program. And I'd like to just say that as we draw to a close here, that these examples of I'm going to say mariculture, which is growing things in the ocean, are somewhat experimental, and it's a function of learning the biology of the organism. So for example, the oysters need relatively clean water, but once you get the oysters living in the harbor, they filter the water, they clean up the water, and there's a tremendous potential for these oysters and their associated ecosystems to make the New York Harbor much more like it was in the past. Clean waters, abundant life. And that is starting to happen. I've been in the waters off of JFK Airport in a small kayak, and you can see marvelous biodiversity in the waters not too far from the New York Harbor. So the progress is happening. The waters are being cleaned up. And it's because we've got people who are paying more and more attention to the sources of pollution, whether it's physical material like plastics or whether it's dirty water, for example, sewage water. And there's many places here in this New York area where when there's a strong rainfall, the sewage is designed to overflow into the ocean. And those systems need to be repaired and need to be modernized so that all the sewage water is treated before it is disposed of into the ocean waters. And this is one example talking about oysters, but there have been people trying to farm salmon, trying to farm cod, trying to farm scallops and prawns, of course. And there's a project off of Australia where they're farming abalone. And then there's a place where they're farming sea cucumbers, which are these wonderful little cucumbers that live on the bottom of the ocean. Some of you might have seen them. They're a very strange little animal, but they're coveted by people, and they dry them out and then rehydrate them and cook them. And then, of course, oysters are being grown worldwide. It's the New York Harbor restoration is a very wonderful thing happening with the Harbor School, but oysters are being grown worldwide as a source of food. So I like to look at the oceans as a place where on the whole Earth, we know the bottoms of the oceans perhaps less well than we know other places like the surface of Mars. The bottoms of the oceans are mysterious. They're out of sight. It's dark down there, but the data are becoming more and more abundant. Things like the Argo buoy system is giving us data on the currents and the salinity and temperature of the oceans. The satellite data that we've shown you this evening illustrates the fact that we know a lot about the surface of the oceans. And I'd like to think that young people going forward are going to be recognizing the value of the oceans as an ecosystem that supports the life in the seas, and that it's worth preserving, it's worth cleaning up, and it's worth modifying our behavior patterns so that we pollute it less, we produce less plastic, and we gradually make the oceans a more habitable place for all the critters that like to live out there. With that, we might see if we've got some questions coming in on the chat. And we've got a few minutes. It's just a little bit before 8. And maybe Mitch, if you see some questions, we can try to see if we can answer them.
Yes, absolutely. We've got a lot of great questions. Also, I'm putting in the chat that survey again. Now that you've seen the program, you'll have more informed answers. And our next Digital Earth will be July 21st, exploring Earth as art. So we hope we can see you again. And again, if you do need to leave, totally fine. But if you can stick around, we've got some time and we've got a lot of great questions. The question that we got asked the most was about those buoys. Do they stay in one place or do they move around with the currents?
So the buoys are an amazing thing. What they've done is they figured out how to make those completely autonomous, meaning that they don't need to be touched by anybody. And the buoys float on their own. And I think they last for years. And they've got a system where they do this, they bob up and down. They come up to the surface to transmit data, and then they drop down. There's a little computer in them that guides them. They drop down and they record the temperature, they record the salinity, and they're looking at the conditions of the water, and then they are carried by the currents, and then they rise up again and transmit the information. I have to imagine, Mitch, that they eventually wash up on the beach somewhere. And I do also imagine that people keep track of their location pretty carefully. And it might be that someone goes out and collects them when they wash ashore, because they certainly are valuable. But no, those buoys are moving. They're made, I see a question, they're made out of plastic, and but also there's metal, and they're very sophisticated. I mean, they of course you can fit a lot of sophistication in a small place now, but they would have batteries in them, and they would have computer chips, and if you can Google, if you Google Argo, ARGO, you'll find out about the buoy system.
And someone also asked, is there a political component? They noticed there aren't any buoys in the South China Sea.
Yeah, no, we looked at that and we noticed that too. And there is, I'm sure, a political component. The Argo website stresses the fact that it's an international project with program with many different countries participating, and there's not a central government that's running the Argo program. So many different governments are participating, but as many of you know, the South China Sea is an area where there's a considerable amount of, I'll say, geopolitical tension. And the Chinese government has been claiming islands in the South China Sea, as have the Philippine government and the Vietnamese government and others. And so there are political tensions in the South China Sea. And I'm not sure if there are no buoys there, or if they just are not telling us where they are or how that's working, but that is one of the places in the seas where there are political challenges.
And then one more question about the buoys. What do the different colors mean?
I suspect that they're different vintages now, and I don't know that for a fact right now, but I sort of was looking at that, and I think there are different campaigns where, for example, the ones that are in the Pacific that have the north-south orientation would represent certainly a scientific endeavor to study the El Nino phenomenon. And so they might be color coded especially for that. You'll see the purple versus the green.
And someone asked, is there any chance that global warming is affecting the ocean temperature in the deep ocean currents? Which, by the way, is the premise of the film, The Day After Tomorrow.
Well, the answer is yes. And so we're studying that hard. In fact, the Argo data are helping us to see that. That thermo-haline circulation, which we mentioned, which is the temperature salt. So thermo-haline is temperature salt circulation. That's the deep water circulation. And the surface waters that are being warmed by the effects of global warming, because the energy is coming from the sun. So the surface warming, which is the global warming phenomenon, is warming those surface currents, and they are dropping down, and they do become cold, but they're becoming somewhat less cold. And that thermal mass is circulating in an ocean that has a circulation timeline of about 1,000 years. And when we talk about the fact that global warming is being, we call it baked into the system, but one of the things that we worry about is that the entire world ocean is starting to warm up, not just from above, but also from within because of these circulating currents.
Wow. And that very cool data set about the biodiversity, how do we get that data? How do we measure?
So that's a good question, of course. And I look at that and wonder a little bit myself, and I have to imagine that there are computer models that are based on very carefully measured data points. And so if we took this map apart, we would find, I anticipate, and you could, if you wanted to dig deeply into that question, you could go to the Science on a Sphere data set and dig into it. But I anticipate that marine biologists, of whom we need lots more, any students out there, marine biologists have an understanding of the biodiversity of places where they've studied carefully, which would include some of the reefs and some of the coastal waters of the world. And then they look at a a bathymetric map, and they look at a computer program that tells them about the water depth and the bioproductivity, like we saw in the photosynthesis chart. And they create a computer model that is a proxy for actual measurements of biodiversity.
Yeah, from what I can tell, the original scientific paper that this is based on, the authors concentrated on just over 1,000 different species that were important for fisheries, for people using the ocean as a resource. And so they probably did exactly as you said, Bob, using a combination of observations at key locations, and then also using computer models to figure out what this distribution looks like at a global scale.
And Ka Chun, while we have you, there's a space question. What is the orbit and altitude of the Json satellite?
I was able to look that up, and they're on the order of about 800 miles up. So the Json satellites, and there are a series of them, as Bob says, they are not as low orbiting as, say, the International Space Station, which is just over 200 miles up, but they are also not at geosynchronous orbit, which is high enough where the satellite stays over one spot. So they're kind of at an intermediate altitude, meaning I don't know exactly how long it would take for them to orbit the Earth, but it's definitely more than a couple of hours, but less than 24 hours, which is what a geosynchronous satellite does.
Nice. And Bob, there's a great geology question. What is the driving force of continental drift?
Well, we know that the center of the Earth is super hot. And so we have a general answer to that question. We talk about convection in the mantle. So the Earth's mantle, which is beneath the Earth's crust, has broad convective patterns in it. So broadly speaking, those convective patterns are driving the plates. Now, it gets a little bit more subtle because when you start to have one plate going down under another, the process we call it'd be like this, we call it subduction. There's a certain amount of pull associated with that downward going slab. So the downward going slab wants to sort of drop. And then the mid-Atlantic ridges or the mid-ocean ridges are relatively high. So there's a certain tendency for material to slide away from the mid-ocean ridges. So the answer is a little bit complicated. There's a variety of forces that are driving the plates, but probably to stay on safe ground, I'd say that the principal motive force is broad scale convection in the mantle of the Earth. And convection is like in a lava lamp. You might have seen, sort of bloops coming up. If you can picture convection, that's what's going on inside the Earth.
Fun with that tie-dye species data set and the lava lamp image. It's got a real aesthetic here. So somebody was wondering, where do blue whales live?
Well, blue whales are one of the species about which we actually know the least because they're very rare. They certainly live in the Pacific Ocean. They live in the Southern Ocean, and but they're very rare animals. And I suspect that we do not have a very good handle on where all the blue whales are, nor how many there are. So that's another marine biology question. And I keep pointing to the fact that science is answering a lot of the questions that we have about the character of the world, the character of the oceans. And as we look at the future, where we see huge challenges, we see tremendous challenges with biodiversity, climate change, ecosystem change, habitat collapse. And we're going to need young people to come forward to study these phenomenon. Blue whales, for example, it must be possible to put a satellite beacon on a blue whale. That can't be an easy thing to do. But if somebody could figure out how to do that, then you'd have a track of where the whale goes. So that's a project for somebody.
Like that. That question is actually a challenge for all of you. So sea turtle lover is curious, what is your favorite sea creature?
My favorite sea creature, I think Well, let's ask that for the three of us. So I'll think of mine, and then I'm going to invite each of you to come up with your favorite sea creature. I like the walrus. It's quite a ponderous creature that lives on the coast up in Alaska, for example, a very amazing animal. So I'll give you a walrus, and maybe turn it over to Mitch. What's your favorite?
I recently first saw for the first time these gorgeous iridescent sea slugs that are just so cool to look at. So I'm going to go with a sea slug. It doesn't sound pretty, but Google it and there's some gorgeous sea slugs.
And now, Ka Chun, what do you think?
I'll go for something with a cultural connection. How about the Dugong, which is like a manatee-like creature, but they're kind of ugly looking, but they float beautifully, and they mammals like them were inspirations for legends about mermaids by mariners. So that's kind of fun to think about.
Yeah.
And more recently, there's a Pokemon inspired, actually probably by many sea creatures. All right, I think that's about the time that we have. Any final thoughts you'd like to leave us with?
Well, I'd certainly like to just underline the fact that the Denver Museum is a go-to place for science, and we are opening back up again. And so we invite all of you to come to the Denver Museum and come visit us and look at our dioramas. And we've got a program in the next couple of years we're going to be putting together that's going to deal with resources and environment, a whole new earth science part of the museum. So come visit us and come see science at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science.
Yeah, and I'll just add on to that we are just about to open an exhibit about numbers in nature, looking at all sorts of patterns and numbers. And there's a mirror maze. It's going to be amazing. All right, Ka Chun, any final thoughts?
What Bob said.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much for joining us, everyone. This has been so much fun. I hope you had a good time with us tonight. And everybody have a wonderful evening.
Good night, everyone.
Yep, good night. Be safe.